Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chloe Chan. I'm from the University of Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Um, so I'm currently a master's student and I study energy insecurity among vulnerable populations in Hong Kong. So I'll be telling you about who exactly these people are in the next 10-ish minutes. But before I get started, I'd just like to acknowledge my funder, the Research Grants Council. Thank you for allowing this research to happen. So let me take you to where I'm from, Hong Kong, one of the densest cities in the world, and this is made further denser by the fact that actually only a quarter of our land is developed. So as you can see, the purple areas up there, and we have a rather high inequality, which means that there's a large disparity in what people are able to afford. Our weather is mostly subtropical, ranging from 26 degrees to 33 degrees Celsius in the summer. So our energy needs are mainly for cooling, and this will just increase as the weather is getting hotter and hotter everywhere, and also in Hong Kong. So you might think that Hong Kong is rather developed. There is no energy insecurity, or as you might have heard of it, energy poverty, which is the lack of access to clean and modern forms of energy. This is usually measured by the 10% indicator. So if your household is spending more than 10% of its household income on energy expenditures, so like electricity, cooking gas, then your household is energy poor. But the thing is, in Hong Kong, even the lowest income households are only spending 7.9% of their income on utilities. And this includes water bills as well. So a better way to think about energy insecurity is to go beyond financial aspects. So it could include environmental, like the housing that you live in. It might be the number of people in your family, etc. Oops. It's also better to think about the vulnerabilities that these people have. So their age, their socioeconomic status, and how this plays into their energy needs. So this leads to the question, what is the situation of energy insecurity in Hong Kong? So to tackle this big problem, my project has 5 main questions, but I'll only be talking about the first one. So the first one pinpoints who exactly are energy insecure, and I've tried to answer this question by looking at secondary literature, which includes NGO and governmental reports, as well as newspaper reports, and interviewing key informants, so people from the government, people from those NGOs, and people from the electricity companies. So as of mid-August, I've interviewed around 18 people over the course of 13 interviews. And we first started with Marta Skynen et al.'s list, which aptly summarizes who in the UK and Europe are vulnerable to energy insecurity. And we've made some modifications, 4 of which I will point out and elaborate on during the next few slides. So people living in not in uninsulated property, because our energy needs are mostly for cooling. People living in informal and low-quality housing rather than people living in the private rented sector, because we have a large private rented sector and there's a big disparity in how the units actually are. Not people living in rural areas, because most of Hong Kong is developed. So the thing is, it's just places are far. So maybe people living in remote areas, and of course, because Hong Kong is a very dense city, people living in dense urban areas, because the urban heat island effect is a real thing. So actually, there are 2 studies that I found in my secondary data that support people living in dense urban areas, and so dense urban areas like Hong Kong Island, Sham Shui Po, Wong Tai Sin, that kind of places. Okay. So I'll first go into this big group of people on lower incomes. Actually, it's a rather large group with many subgroups, and this is a population that has received a lot of attention in, say, newspapers. So there are newspaper reports of how increased temperatures and increased electricity prices might impact the Hong Kong's lowest income people. And this group was actually mentioned by key informants from all 3 sectors, which is the electricity company, government, and NGOs. So their vulnerability comes from the low income, so they might not be able to afford electricity. So there are subgroups, which are the elderly living alone, asylum seekers and refugees, and people living in informal / low quality housing. So for the elderly, their main vulnerability comes from the fact that they're retired and they don't have income, but they're probably only living on government assistance, which is around $3,000 to $4,000 per month. Spatially, they might be in the satellite towns, which is where the remote areas are. The next group has only been mentioned by one key informant, so I think it's a rather overlooked group, but they are very vulnerable because they're not allowed to work in Hong Kong, and they've only been given $300 per month for utilities. So utilities includes water, electricity, and cooking gas. And as a result of this, they might have to purchase some non-conventional energy needs. So yeah. The next group are people living in informal/low quality housing. So Hong Kong is very dense. We barely have enough houses for our people. So there are a lot of subdivided units going on. The space is very small, like say the size of a car. There are multiple NGOs that are servicing these populations. And this was mentioned by a lot of key informants, and actually this subgroup may experience energy insecurity even further if they overlap with other groups. For example, people with children, parents would rather have a higher energy bill and turn on the aircon for longer than have their children suffer in heat. Also, one extra aspect that makes this situation worse is that the subdivisions, they are not good housing spaces, so they might not actually have windows, so they can't ventilate their houses. So they're basically forced to turn on the air conditioning. Spatially, these units are where the older Chinese buildings are, and these buildings don't exactly have lifts, so this is another vulnerability. So, for example, if you have mobility difficulties and you live in this area, you'll have an even worse time. So some interesting interim findings are from government key informants and from key informants representing ethnic minority groups. So for the government key informants, there was a clear subdivision of which department should be responsible for energy insecurity. Because energy is governed by the Environment and Ecology Bureau, a lot of my respondents have asked me to interview them. But those people have also pointed out that landlords as well as power companies have a role to play in alleviating energy insecurity. Also, another interesting point is that government key informants talk a lot about the financial aspect of energy insecurity. So they mentioned a lot of cash assistances that the government is giving to these vulnerable populations. For ethnic minority key informants, one thing they explicitly said is that some people from the Hong Kong Nepalese population might have a higher vulnerability because they tend to have a lot of people in one household and they live in older houses. But on the other hand, some people from the Hong Kong Bangladeshi population might be less vulnerable as they have good jobs and they think that energy safety is a priority, so they will purchase only branded goods so there's no risk of electrical fires. So just to sum up, this is what I have from my key informants and secondary literature data review so far. So you can see that there are only 5 main groups instead of the 12 or so that I listed earlier. And this is based on what the key informants have said. They overlap because people belonging to multiple of these groups. For example, if you're an asylum seeker, you don't have a lot of income, you might be renting an informal/low quality house. And these are people living on low income, so they have extra vulnerability to energy insecurity. However, this is just the first part of my research. So following this, I will also be interviewing people who experience energy insecurity. So I'll be interviewing refugees and asylum seekers, people like elderly living alone, for example, to see what their experience of energy insecurity is like. And according to that data, the taxonomy that I have right now will probably change. Additionally, aside from looking at who these people are, I'll be also looking what are their experiences, how do they cope? So for example, if they don't want to pay that much for electricity, will they go out? Will they, say, purchase butane gas instead of LPG or town gas? And lastly, after all of this, I will be answering what should be done to alleviate energy insecurity in Hong Kong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chloe. Do we have questions from the audience? There's a question back.
I can speak loudly if that's okay.
Okay.